In this video, I want to play around with the summarize and the group by functions. I have a table with salespeople and month, and then the sales. And what you'll notice is that I have some salespeople that made multiple sales in the same month. So I want to reduce this table into a table that has one row for the salesperson and the month. Instead of two rows with Aki and February, I only want one. And I can solve this in many ways. So I'll start out by making a new calculated table, which will then be based on this original table. Meaning I want to first summarize my table, which is aptly named. And I want to do that based on salesperson and on month, which will then give me exactly what I expect, which is one row for each month that salesperson has made a sale. And in this case, all the salespeople made one sale, at least one sale for each of the 2 months. But I then need to bring in my actual sales, and you can do this, that is make a calculated column. But you shouldn't do this using the summarize, and this is a bit hard for me to explain, but basically it's just a bad idea because it can give you some solutions you weren't expecting, and it will be hard to troubleshoot it. But I'm just going to do it to show that you can do it, and it's very simple because it's literally just sum, and then because I'm acting on the table, then I can just bring it in. And then it understands that I need to calculate this based on basically the window into this table. So it's doing it's working like a measure where it's creating the filter context. So for Aki and February, it's going to combine 800 and 300, which would then give me 1100, which is exactly what I expect. But this is bad, and we don't do this because it can give unexpected results. What I have to do instead is to use Addcolumns to add a column to my summary. So if I move this to a new line, then this is the table I'm acting on and I want to add a column to, and that will then be sum of sales. But if I then do exactly what I did before, which is to sum the sales column, this is going to give me an unexpected result because it's going to give me the exact same result. And this took me a while to understand. It's explained in the book, The Definitive Guide to DAX. And basically Addcolumns is an iterator, which means that there's no filter context, there's a row context instead. So sum of table sales will sum the entire column, which is not what I want. So the solution is either to use a measure instead of actualize sum, or you can wrap this and calculate, which does a context transition, which is normally expensive, but it's okay here. And at that point I already have what I want, but I want to go beyond this and say, maybe I only want to see those combinations of salesperson and month where the sum of sales is above 1000, which I can then do. Actually, I want to write filter first before I go into a new line. And this is just going to make it a bit easier to understand the layers I'm working on. So now I want to filter the Addcolumns table, so this table, and I want to filter that based on the sum of sales column, which is then a calculated column, which is why you don't get the prefix here. Here it's writing apostrophe table apostrophe because sum of sales is calculated. So I want to say I only want to keep those rows where this value is greater than 1000. And then there's only 4 left. And again, I can then do another question here. So I could stop here because maybe my boss only wants to know, well, which salespeople times month made sales greater than 1000. This might be what my boss is interested in. Or maybe they only want to know the names of salespeople that had at least 1 month where they made a sale greater than 1000. So it's always important to ask what question are you trying to answer. In this case, I do want to answer that question. So I want to change the name of Summarize 1 to say salespeople who sold at least 1K, because I can then go beyond and say, again, I want to summarize this table. I want to know the names here, which normally you'd use values to remove duplicates because I have Kobeni twice here, but values won't work because it's going to get mad at me and say that it's expecting a column and not a whole table, but I do have a whole table. So I can use another function, which is just to summarize again. So I now have an inner summarize and an outer summarize. Actually, that should be down here. So upon this table, I'm now summarizing based on the salesperson, which is then from the table and not from this calculated table, which is a bit trippy, I think, but it works because it's grabbing salesperson from this table, meaning this table is then the answer to the question, which salespeople have had a month where they sold for at least 1000. And it doesn't matter that Kobeni did that in 2 months, because I only care about those who have done it at least once. For completionist purposes, I'm going to do a repeat of this table where I don't add that last summarize because, again, that might be the question your boss wants to answer. So I don't want to summarize. I want to show only those rows where the salesperson has sold for at least 1,000. And then I need to change that name with sales above 1,000. Again, it's two different questions. This is just the number of salespeople who have sold for at least 1,000 in a month, and this is then those months where the sale has been over 1,000. In this table, I use Summarize to summarize based on a calculated column, which the SQL BI people who are also behind the book, The Definitive Guide to DAX, they say that you shouldn't do this, and it's explained in this article. Basically, it has to do with something called clustering, which I don't completely understand, but the gist of it is that when you want to summarize or do a grouping based on a column that exists within a table, which is what I'm doing here, you should use Summarize. But when you want to group based on a calculated column, so what they call a local column, one that's made within this query, you shouldn't use Summarize, you should use Group By. So I can repeat this query, but instead using Group By in my outer Summarize. So if I just delete this, and then we get back to this, and the question here was I only wanted the salespeople. So instead I should be using Group By. Tricky thing about Group By is that normally when you try to do grouping based on a column here, which I'll do in a moment, you need to use the Currentgroup function, which isn't relevant here because it wants me to get a table. So it's only showing functions that give me a table. But I don't have to worry about that right now. I can simply say Group By, and this is my inner table, then the comma. And what do I want to group based on? Well, I want to do that based on the salesperson. In other words, functionally, what I'm doing here is just deleting duplicates. And because Group By, well, it's removed all the columns I don't specify in my grouping, I'm left up with the same output as right here, except I've sorted it. So this gives the exact same output, and the only difference is actually just this word at the top where it says Summarize, and here it says Group By. When you're doing a grouping like this, it's very simple, but when you do another grouping where you want to do a calculation, for instance, which I'll show in a moment, where I actually want to do something other than filtering, then you need to use this Currentgroup function, which will make sense in a moment. Also, actually, before I get to that, I want to show that maybe you, in this query where I show all the rows, maybe you don't care about what month it was, you only care about the person and the sales. I can make another calculated table where I do that. No months. And here you would then want to use the Selectcolumns, which again takes a table as an argument. I then want to say, well, what columns do I want to select? And here I can change the name. So maybe I want the salesperson column to be called sales with a space. And then I need to grab the salesperson column. And then I also want my sum of sales, which I want with a capital letter. This is a calculated column. I don't get the prefix here, but otherwise it's the exact same thing. I want to do a grouping where I want to show how many rows have a sum of sales above a threshold and how many have below it. And I'll be a good boy and actually use variables this time. I want to have a threshold, which is then equal to 1,000 in this case. And just as before, I want to do a summarize on my table based on salesperson and month, which is the one we're used to. And then upon this, I want to add a column, and that column should then be the calculated sum of tables. And I actually need to use an if statement, but for now I want to get the calculated column so we can see what's going on. So as before, it's calculated sum of sales. And again, I need to calculate because Addcolumns is an iterator, and this gives us what I'm used to. But I wanted an if statement so that I can group this into above the threshold or below, meaning I want an if calculate. If this is greater than or equal to my threshold, then I want to return big. And if it's below the threshold, I want to return small. And I'll have it into small and big. And as I showed with these two queries, I should be using Group By when I want to group on a calculated column. And the article I showed will go into depth as to why that is, because I don't fully understand clustering. I just know it makes it more expensive to run, meaning I want to use Group By and then new line. And then upon this table, I then want to group based on my big small sales, which doesn't have a prefix because it's the calculated column. And then we can see what happens. I get small and big, but I don't just want these two values. That doesn't help me at all. I want to add a column, which needs to be within the parentheses. And the name of that column is then going to be, which is a bit hard to explain what it actually is. It's going to be, let's just write 1 for now, because I actually need to explain something. because you can't just do a count rows here, because what table is it acting upon? It's not acting upon the whole group by table. It's acting upon the window into the group by table. Well, this here table. It's acting on this table, but I need to do a filtered version of this table. In other words, a window function. So what table am I actually acting upon? I'm acting upon a filtered version of the table. When you use group by, you have access to this keyword called Currentgroup, which lets you do this window operation because it gives you access to the subtable representing the current group. So for each row in my big small tables, I get access to the subtable or the window. And since I need to count rows, I don't want to do a sum or anything else. I want to do this thing here. I want to do a Countx because X is an iterator. I want to iterate over the current group, which is a subtable or window. And then the actual operation I want to do is I don't want to count the sales, so I don't want to sum the sales. I want to count the number of rows, which this does. So I can say instead of count rows, I want to say count X and acting upon current group, and my expression is then just a 1. Then I need another parenthesis. And this will then give me, and this is why the column name can be a bit tricky to figure out, because this is saying how many rows do I have where the sales is below the threshold, and how many rows do I have where the sales is equal to or greater than the threshold. Each row represents a combination between the salesperson and the month. If the salesperson made a sale that month, and if there were sales in that month, then you get it. So it's not just the number of sales in the month, it's the number of sales per salesperson, because one person can make multiple sales in that month, but that amount can be below the threshold. So it can be a bit tricky to understand and explain what this actually means. But the important bit is that you can go up here and change around the variable and say that maybe your threshold is 1100, then it did nothing, but 1150. Then there were only 3 months where each individual salesperson were able to make sales above this. And likewise, I can do 800 and say that now there were 6 people who had a month where they made a sale equal to above the threshold. This might mean that there was 1 person who had 6 good months, or there were 6 people who had 1 good month, or any mixture in between. But this lets you play around with it if you want to, because this is a variable, which I didn't do here where I filtered. So this should be a variable instead, but that's not hard to change if you really want to. This was 4 different queries that all answer a different question based on a simple sales table, and also showing the situations where you should use summarize and where you should use group by. So in these 2 cases, you should be using group by because I'm grouping on a calculated column. Actually, I'm not grouping based on a calculated column here. I'm doing it on an existing column. So I shouldn't be using this group by. I should use summarize. But yeah,